the quiet rumble of armored vehicles in American streets, the unsettling sight of military fatigues where only local police once stood. It is a spectacle that once belonged solely to wartime documentaries or dystopian fiction. Yet, critics warn that this is a new, alarming reality, marking a perilous point in the nation's history. Across the political spectrum, alarms are ringing. The deployment, the permanence, and the purpose of federal forces, specifically the U.S. military, in major domestic urban centers is being decried as nothing less than an unlawful power grab. A collision between executive ambition and constitutional limits is now, according to legal scholars, a clear and present constitutional crisis. The foundations of the republic, they argue, are being tested by a perceived unprecedented overreach, pushing the nation to a breaking point, a point where the very idea of a unified United States appears perilously close to collapse, stirring whispered fears of civil war brewing. This is the story of that warning, and a legal battle for the soul of the nation. The deployment began with a seemingly justifiable premise: to quell unrest, to restore order, and protect federal property. Yet, as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the presence of active-duty military and militarized federal agents remained, shifting from a response to an establishment. It is this sustained presence, critics argue, that transforms the executive action from a temporary measure into a systematic erosion of the checks and balances that define American governance. The very notion of using the Posse Comitatus Act, the federal law limiting the use of the military for domestic law enforcement, as a mere inconvenience rather than a sacrosanct principle is what has fueled the most intense condemnations. For decades, the act has stood as a bulwark against martial law, a solemn promise that the nation's military would not be turned inward against its own citizenry. The current situation, according to a coalition of former attorneys general and constitutional lawyers, represents a calculated attempt to circumvent, if not outright dismantle, that protection. The constitutional red line, Posse Comitatus, and the Insurrection Act. At the heart of the legal controversy lies a perceived misuse and potential abuse of the Insurrection Act of 1807. This rarely invoked piece of legislation grants the President the power to deploy the U.S. Armed Forces for domestic law enforcement purposes under specific, extreme conditions, such as suppression of a significant insurrection or domestic violence that state authorities cannot control. Historically, its application has been sparse and intensely debated, reserved for moments of genuine national emergency, such as the Civil Rights era to enforce desegregation or in the wake of natural disasters. What is concerning to critics is not merely the invocation of the act, but the elasticity with which it has been applied. Legal experts warn that the threshold for its use has been arbitrarily lowered, where the act demands a clear failure of state governance. The current administration, critics claim, has instead declared that failure preemptively or in response to political dissent rather than genuine, widespread, and uncontrollable violence. The decision-making process, they argue, appears decoupled from the factual assessment of state capacity and linked more closely to political expediency or punitive measures against local jurisdictions deemed hostile to the administration. This shift, they assert, sets a dangerous precedent, effectively granting a future president the unilateral power to declare an insurrection based on minor civil disturbances or even peaceful, organized protests, thereby normalizing the sight of military personnel policing civilian life. The principle of federalism is also under severe strain. The foundation of the American system delegates broad police powers to states and localities. The militarization of domestic law enforcement, directed from the top down, is seen as an unprecedented usurpation of state autonomy, effectively overriding the will of democratically elected local and state officials. Governors and mayors, regardless of their political affiliation, have voiced strong objections, arguing that their capacity to manage civil situations has been deliberately undermined. They maintain that the federal intervention is not only unwanted, but is actively escalating tensions, turning manageable protests into confrontations due to the aggressive tactics and lack of appropriate training military personnel possess for civilian crowd control. The distinction between a soldier trained to engage an enemy combatant and a police officer trained for de-escalation, critics stress, is a vital one that has been dangerously blurred. D. Executive overreach and the erosion of democratic norms. Beyond the legal statutes, The warnings center on the erosion of crucial democratic norms and increasing politicization of the military. When the military is deployed domestically, its actions inherently become political. The perception, according to numerous political scientists, is that the executive branch is employing the ultimate symbol of national defense, the armed forces, as a tool for domestic political control. This perception is devastating because it breaks the sacred covenant of trust between the military and the civilian populace. The military, traditionally viewed as an apolitical institution dedicated to national security, risks being recast as the enforcement arm of a specific political agenda. The language used by the administration to justify the ongoing deployment further exacerbates these fears. Phrases like dominate the battle space when referring to American streets or labeling dissenters as domestic terrorists are not merely rhetorical flourishes. They are, in the eyes of critics, a deliberate attempt to frame political opposition as an existential national security threat. This rhetorical strategy serves a dual purpose. It justifies the extreme measure of military deployment and simultaneously dehumanizes political opponents, making aggressive federal action against them seem necessary, even heroic. The concern is not just about the current president, but the precedent being established for future executives. By expanding the interpretation of what constitutes an insurrection and normalizing the use of the military in cities, the administration is effectively weaponizing the presidency. A future executive, equipped with this broadened power, could theoretically bypass the judicial system and Congress entirely, relying on the sheer force of the military to enforce policy or suppress unfavorable electoral outcomes. This hypothetical scenario, where the military is positioned as the final arbiter of political disputes, is the core of the constitutional crisis warning. The Civil War parallel. Secession of spirit, not just land. The inclusion of the phrase Civil War brewing in the title is not merely sensationalism. It reflects the deep, existential anxiety expressed by historians and commentators regarding the current state of national division. Critics are not necessarily predicting a formal secession of states or a replay of the 1860s battle lines. Instead, they warn of a civil war of the spirit, a complete and irreconcilable breakdown of civic trust and shared reality. The presence of the military in cities, particularly when opposed by local elected officials, fosters a profound sense of alienation. Citizens in those localities may begin to perceive the federal government not as a representative entity, but as an occupying force. This feeling of occupation, coupled with an already deeply partisan media environment, drives an intense polarization where each side views the other not just as political opponents, but as enemies of the state. When different parts of the country see the same event, the deployment of troops, through fundamentally different lenses, one seeing order restored, the other seeing tyranny enforced, the ability for a unified nation to function dissolves. Historians point to several factors accelerating this brewing conflict. Weaponization of information. The deliberate manipulation of facts to justify military action deepens the distrust in all federal institutions. Erosion of institutional neutrality. The perceived bending of the Justice Department and the military chain of command to political will destroys the neutral ground necessary for conflict resolution. The us versus them paradigm. The aggressive demonization of protesters, activists, and even journalists by federal agencies create a narrative of perpetual internal conflict. This environment is fertile ground for radicalization. If a significant segment of the population comes to believe that the constitutional process has been entirely subverted and that their only redress is force, a force now being openly modeled by the executive branch itself, the move from heated rhetoric to actual armed conflict becomes a tragically short step. The deployment, therefore, is viewed not as a solution to violence, but as an incendiary act that threatens to ignite the latent tensions already simmering beneath the surface of the nation. The military's uncomfortable position, oath versus order. One of the most delicate and alarming aspects of this crisis is the position it places upon the men and women of the U.S. Armed Forces. Soldiers, Marines, sailors, and airmen swear an oath to support and defend the Constitution, not a political party or an individual president. The current deployments force military leaders and service members to confront a profound ethical dilemma when an order to deploy domestically against the stated wishes of local government is perceived by constitutional scholars as potentially unlawful or unconstitutional. Where does a service member's ultimate loyalty lie? Senior military figures, often speaking anonymously or after retirement, have voiced deep concern over the long-term impact on the military's cohesion and relationship with the public. They stress that the military is not designed, equipped, or trained to be a domestic political police force. Deploying them into these contentious roles risks hollowing out the apolitical nature of the force. Furthermore, it risks driving a wedge between the rank and file, whose family and friends may be among the protesters, and the chain of command, who are implementing the orders. The response from high-ranking military officials has been mixed. Some have publicly resigned or voiced subtle criticisms, citing concerns over the politicization of the force. Others have maintained silence, adhering to the principle of civilian control over the military, but critics warn that this silence can be interpreted as acquiescence to executive overreach. The critical issue is the need for a unified, clear statement from the highest echelons of the Pentagon, a statement that unequivocally reaffirms the constitutional limits on the military's domestic role and its absolute independence from partisan politics. The failure to do so, according to civil rights groups, leaves the nation vulnerable to the possibility that the military, inadvertently or not, could become the chief instrument of an authoritarian shift. The path forward, legislative and judicial recourse. The warnings from critics are ultimately a desperate plea for the other two branches of government to fulfill their constitutional duties. The focus is now squarely on Congress and the judiciary to act as the ultimate checks on executive power. Number 1. Legislative action. Congress, critics argue, has the immediate power to rein in the executive branch. This could take the form of reforming the Insurrection Act, amending the act to impose stricter, less ambiguous triggers for its invocation, and requiring specific congressional approval for deployments lasting longer than a set short period, e.g. 72 hours. Defunding specific deployments. Utilizing the power of the purse to prohibit the use of appropriated funds for domestic military deployments deemed unconstitutional or unnecessary by the legislature. Censure and investigation. Initiating formal investigations and proceedings to assess the legality and necessity of the current deployments. 2. Judicial intervention. Legal challenges are already being mounted, seeking judicial review of the president's actions. The core legal argument rests on challenging the factual predicate for the Insurrection Act's use, i.e., proving that the violence does not genuinely rise to the level of an uncontrollable insurrection required by the statute. However, the courts have historically been reticent to intervene in national security and military matters, adhering to the political question doctrine. Critics stress that for the courts to remain silent now, in the face of what they call an explicit constitutional transgression, would be to abdicate their role as the ultimate protector of the rule of law.